Hello there. Um, so today I'm doing a little bit of live coding, and I was hoping to basically work on KitSmith and also sort of take everyone through the back end of the application and essentially just the code generally. And then I'm thinking that we're essentially just going to work on some features and see how everything goes. So, as of right now, the way that the app works is fairly rudimentary. It's just a basic React app. It's an SPA approach. I didn't feel like doing an MPA for this. Maybe eventually in the future we will do something a little bit more complicated. But for now, since we're just working on mostly an MVP, I'm going to basically just work through an MPA now, or an MVP SPA. So I've got the login ability here. That's pretty basic stuff. Although it doesn't look like it is currently working, so that's great. This is in a very early stages, to say the least. Oh yeah, this is okay. Hold on, what's the wrong? There we go. So now I'm logged in, and I can go to the interface, and what we've got here is just a React flow, which I would definitely take a look at if you're building anything that sort of requires custom nodes and then basically being able to construct these complex flows. A good example of this is Flowwise, which uses this under the hood. I would definitely recommend checking them out if you have something that fits that use case. So anyway, what we have is essentially, for now, before we get into the 3D view, we're working through building out a 2D view, which will essentially look something like this. We'll have the plate carrier itself modeled as a bunch of different fields, basically variables that could make up a plate carrier. And then we have different nodes that will be used to construct all of those variables. And then once we have all of those relationships mapped together, then eventually we'll have a 3D preview, which will essentially show your plate carrier and body armor in 3D space. And you'll be able to basically drag and drop products that actually exist, and they'll have 3D representations in the KitSmith application. This will be super useful for people who basically need to get up and running with some body armor but don't know exactly how yet. There's a lot of information that you have to obtain from research in order to make knowledgeable choices about how you're putting together your kit. And even then, there are a lot of issues in terms of working through compatibility issues and knowing what you're going to actually get. So we are essentially trying to streamline that with a fairly intuitive and beginner-friendly 3D interface, but also 2D layout, as we can see right here, at least for the beginning stages while we're getting everything set up. So essentially, since we are going to be working with 3D models that we are not only mapping ourselves, but then putting into 3JS and then using that to render them, but also modeling the relationships between individual products and allowing you to actually edit with individual products that companies can eventually upload the different relationships between 3D objects and new 3D objects. There are a lot of engineering problems that need to be solved in order to do that. So in order to sort of simplify that process and abstract it a little bit so that we can get the relationships between all of the objects down before making a proper 3D editor, we're going to make a 2D editor, which basically uses React Flow to account for all of the different variables, and then we're going to use that data that is built up through the use of the 2D editor to render a 3D preview for the user that they can explore. Then eventually you'll be able to edit straight into the 3D preview, but this is just a way of sort of getting down all of the relationships. So, how are we going to do this? Well, we already have, as you can see, a few nodes. So we've got the plate carrier, we've got the plate carrier specs, and the plate carrier specs can map into the plate carrier itself. And then we've got color options that go into the plate carrier specs, the size options, etc. And it's basically going to work like this for all different levels of defining a plate carrier. But what we need to be able to do is not just have all of these already available on here, but since we're building this out, we want to basically be able to drag and drop in different nodes. So that is the functionality that I'm going to be working through right now. As you can see, right now we have a bunch of these initial nodes selected, and we don't necessarily want that. Eventually, maybe we'll have like presets. Basically, you won't have to drag and drop everything, ideally, but for now, we're just going to work with it like you can select different nodes and you can drag and drop them, ideally from over here. So, let's check this out. So right now, I've got the nodes component, which is working with the on the toolbar side of things. Say there are nodes and there are products. So right now, products don't actually work, but essentially a product will be like a collection of nodes, and also that would reference preset products in the backend. For example, if I wanted to model the JPC2 and I wanted to sort of set up a configuration which uses the JPC2 body armor, then I could basically take this, drag and drop it, and then it would autofill all of the different information that I need based on the specs of the JPC2, and then I could just work on adding in accessories and stuff like that. So that is essentially what we'll be doing, is allowing to drag and drop first in order to build up all of these node relationships, and then eventually we're going to be adding support for individual products to drag and drop those. So in order to do that, let's take a look at the actual nodes component. So right now what it's doing is it's basically taking these preset nodes, and honestly it's probably better to just make this a variable in here and then delete this file. We don't need to be importing it from a JSON file. Basically this is just what we have for now, is a collection of hard-coded preset nodes, and then there's basically defined in the actual layout. There are currently, I believe, 4 different, all of these different node types. So the way the React flow kind of works, if you're not familiar, is essentially you have this graph, you have this sort of layout, and we have that in the React flow canvas here. And then this takes a selection of nodes, edges, and essentially graphs them together. So it allows you to connect the different nodes together using edges and allow for data flows. So we have all of these different types of nodes. We have the plate carrier, the size options, we have the plate carrier specs, the color options, and then eventually, these aren't actually like made and modeled out yet, but we do have the carrier and the cummerbund and shoulder straps node that will be modeled, and those will allow us to basically build out an entire plate carrier. So now that we have that sort of baseline, you can see that over here we have just one node right now, which obviously is kind of not very well modeled at the moment, but you can see that the name is at least rendered, and the reason for that is this label right here. So I'm going to make the label a little bit more specific, or a little bit better formatted, that is. And then the ID schema is essentially going to be a way of determining what the actual ID of the node should look like. So right now it has node, and then it has this little like formatting string type thing, which will let us parse when we are handling the drag event, essentially, and adding our node to the canvas. We'll parse this and we'll just slap in the ID that actually fits, because we don't actually know the ID of this yet. It's more like a template. So we'll put a description in here, a node for representing a plate carrier, nothing too fancy, and then we'll look at the rest of the nodes in here. We can even just make these into a comment. Yeah, it's kind of whatever. Okay, that doesn't matter. So first thing we're going to label is size options, the size options. Okay, perfect. Now I've got GitHub Copilot kind of doing this boilerplate for me. That's the best way to use it. Essentially, give it a comment, give it a little bit of context, and then give it a pattern, and it'll probabilistically match that pattern, which is pretty useful. Okay, cool. So, wait, I need shoulder straps in there. I would definitely not recommend becoming reliant on Copilot, but its suggestions are really useful when you are building out sort of these repetitive lists of pretty similar data, but data that isn't similar enough to basically like to just copy and paste. There's a little bit of variability, obviously, between all of these, but they're similar enough to where Copilot can pretty reliably recognize that pattern. So now we have all of these nodes on here, and as you can see, they're all kind of mapped out here. Obviously, this isn't how we want them to look, though, so let's, in here, make these look a little bit prettier. How exactly do we want them to look? Right now we have the node label. We don't want that to be an H2, that's for sure. But I'm also thinking, I'm using Mantine, by the way. If anybody's wondering kind of what this UI library that I'm using is, it is Mantine, and I would definitely recommend Mantine. Mantine is an excellent resource. They make a lot of really great UI components. It's mantine.dev, and I can show you. I'm not going to try to tab everything, but essentially they have a ton of different components that you can use to build up your framework. And yeah, I would definitely recommend checking them out. Anyway, so I'm using Mantine, and in here we can actually just use a lot of their preset components, like the grid component and then the title component. So I'm going to be using the title component here, and that's where it basically renders an H tag for you of the order that you give it. So order 3 is going to render an H2 tag. Now, I also want to make available the description, but I also want to make available the type. So in order to do that, I'm going to kind of divide these into their own little section here. I'm not sure I have styles up and running yet. I do not. So I'm using CSS modules. Nodes. Module.css. Now, what that means is that I can get scoped CSS working, and essentially that works by importing styles or whatever you want to call your file name from the SCSS or CSS file. You need a preprocessor like Node Sass to actually get this working, and I'm using ESBuild, so that's why I have the ESBuild Sass plugin. But essentially what that means is that I can just import styles from here, and then it will make a like random class name. Like it'll basically make all of these class names look like that on build time, and then they'll be automatically scoped to each React component. That way I don't have to add more like super specific class names myself, or like think it's BEM or whatever it was called. I don't want to follow those standards. So now I can essentially reference these different class names like so. Basically, since I have the node class, I can add the class name here. And if I wanted to add multiple class names, I could do that as well using the interpolation syntax in JavaScript. But I don't need to do that, so I'm going to get rid of that for now. Essentially, that's how you do it. Now, make this styles and then node header. And then what this will let us do, this will be the sort of meta info. And actually, there are some useful utility components that are supported by Mantine, such as the flex component. And basically, the first thing that I want here is the node.type. I want to easily be able to see what the actual type of a different node is, of a node is, and then I also want the description. So now it should look like that. And if I go back over to Firefox, now you can see that I've got these beautiful, beautiful components up and running. Now, obviously, that's not what we really want them to look like. So let's see about getting our variables imported. Use. Now, here's one of the really annoying things about Copilot is this. So now, essentially what's happening is Copilot's like, oh, I recognize this pattern. This pattern is basically, we're in an SCSS file, and we want to use some partial, such as variables or mixins, and so I'm going to autocomplete the path to the file. This is one of the most annoying things that I have encountered with GitHub Copilot is that it will disable my other autocomplete in favor of making something that looks right, but if I go to this, obviously it doesn't exist, and it will say unable to open this because it doesn't actually exist. Do you want to create it? I don't want to create it. I want to use the one that I already have. So I basically have to just do this really fast and hope that it doesn't. I'm sure that there is a way to properly handle this situation. I would love to know it if anybody knows, but I don't. So we're just going to do it my way of typing it really fast and hoping that it works as expected. So I've got these variables here. I'm going to try to put them to a little bit of good use, trying to make this a little bit pretty. Obviously, I've got the like sort of product syntax here, so I think I'm going to kind of reuse that. Product card. So we want all of that stuff. Basically just gonna slap that in there. Yeah, I've got the padding, I've got the align items. That's pretty nice. And then if I go back over to Firefox, yeah, now you can see that I've got this up and running. I do obviously need to change the text align. Back to left, and now everything's a little bit better aligned. Now, obviously, there is a bit of an issue as well. Perhaps this isn't the best way of displaying the size options or the sort of type of the node right next to its description. So instead of doing it that way, I think I'm going to eliminate this flex component, let that stand as is. I'm going to change the size of this to extra small, and I'm going to change the color to gray, and then I'm going to do the same thing here, size extra small, but I'll keep it the same color. So one tip with, obviously that isn't as nice as it could be. One tip with typography that I've heard and I've put into use since I heard it is instead of making two different, instead of separating things by font size, separate them by color and font weight and keep only a couple of different font sizes. And that seems to look a little bit nicer. So that's what I'm trying to kind of implement here. Obviously this needs to be a different color, but that's kind of what I'm up to at the moment. I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a class name to this. I should be able to do that. So Mantine exposes a couple of different APIs for each of their components, but like for example the class names component or the class names API, which basically lets me I can go in here and I can reference for a given component. If I go over to the documentation and I search for the text component, then it'll show me the component props, and usually it'll show me the styles API, but I think it's telling me that this is, oh yeah, it's telling me that this is a polymorphic component. So if I go to some other sort of component, then it'll actually provide me with the styles API, which means that I can type in styles essentially, and instead of style, which is just available on every React component, you can type styles as one of its props, and then you can basically access individual styles in individual elements within the component and style them. So it's kind of useful, especially since they provide a lot of Mantine is fairly opinionated in that it provides a lot of styles right off the bat. So if you want to provide custom styles and functionality, this is a way to do it using the styles API. So it's a very long-winded way of saying that I want to change the color of this text element. Now, it doesn't make it super easy to change the color, unfortunately. I very much wish that it did. Obviously, I changed it here, but what I need to do is I need to change it to whatever this background color thing is here. So I'm going to try to do that with a class name. Class name, styles, and then we're going to call this the type, the node type. So now that we've added that, we can come over here, we can use some SCSS syntax to select down to it, and then we're going to give this a color of, and what do we want it to look like? We're going to use RGBA anyway, and then we're just going to reference this like so, and take text color and zoom that, and then we just want like a dimmer version of the text color. So hopefully by doing that, we should have, there we go, we have a little bit like a more opaque and a little bit grayer version to denote the type. So that's nice. Now we have that, and it kind of makes things look a little bit nicer, although still not super nice. I'm still not super satisfied with what this looks like, if I'm being honest. What to add? I think what I'm going to do is the type is actually going to just be pushed up into the top right corner. So let's go and access this header, select the header, and we're going to give it a position of relative, and then in type we're going to give this a position of absolute, if I can type, that is. I'm going to give this top 8px or 0.8 rem, since I'm trying to be better at using relative units. And then we're going to give it right of 0.8 rem. So now I can go over here and I can see if that worked. It did, but questionably. It is now kind of how we would expect, but obviously it doesn't look super good. So we're actually going to, instead of using the very convenient text node, we're just going to make this a span, and we're going to do whatever we want to it at this point. We're just going to make it look exactly how we want it to, instead of relying on Mantine. Fortunately, Mantine with this specific component doesn't actually do too much, so should just be able to make the font size something really small, and then you can see what it'll look like. It looks a little bit better. Now, it still has that 8 units of size, but we should be able to, if we do right, yeah, so top, if we make that 0, and then we make this 0 as well, yeah, that looks better. I'm guessing that's because the header itself actually is positioned inside a little bit, and since we're doing this relative to the header, we're positioning it relative to the header. So yeah, those are some annoying sort of CSS stuff. CSS is the hardest part of programming, 100%. Okay, cool. So it works. Obviously, it doesn't look very good here, though. So what we actually want to do is, instead of being at top like that, we want to do top negative 0.8 rem. Don't ever trust Copilot. It'll break your heart, evidently. So that looks a little bit better. We do want it to be a little bit smaller, though. Let's just make it 1 rem, see how that looks. And that's starting to get into the right sort of domain. Let's make it a little bit smaller. I just don't want really any overlap with plate carrier specs with the title. So I'm probably going to add a little bit more of a padding on the top level. So I'll do 1.8 rem. And we'll just keep that as so above. So now it looks a little bit better. We can see what the type is. We can see the description. I'm going to toggle the description to be a little bit lighter as well. So the class name styles.description. When it comes to styles, I probably aggressively overstyle. So I'm sorry if that is the case. No description. And then we're going to grab this color, and we don't want that color exactly, but we do want something like it. This color we're probably going to make a little bit more mute, and then we'll keep this one at like 0.85 or something like that. Just it's a little dimmer is the hope than the other thing, than the title. Now that we have that, we can essentially get started. Putting a little bit more space between each of these. Each of these nodes should probably have a little bit more space between it. Let's go down to the grid, and for each of these, we essentially want to return that's not going to work. What do I want to do here? I want to put a little bit more space between all of these different nodes. And since I'm using different grids, I can do that since I'm doing this within a grid, I can actually add a gutter. So I'll do a gutter, and I'll make it 24 pixels. And now you can see that these are a little bit more spaced out. That's just nice because now we can see them a little bit more distinctly. So now that we have these, you can see that I have this little grabbiness, but that's only because the cursor is set to look like that right here. So what I need to do is essentially actually add some functionality to drag. So we're going to look into the drag API. Drag and drop API. So what this allows us to essentially do is we can put a drag event on an individual element. So I can do on drag start, and then I'm going to make an event handler handle drag start, and then this takes an event which is an HTML or which is a React drag event on an HTML div element, and then I can basically just console log the drag started, and then we'll log out the event for now. We kind of want to see what's happening there. So I'll handle the drag start, go back here. And now, we'll check in the console. When I do start dragging, it's not going to do anything. And I'm guessing that's because it's not draggable. So now if I do that, you can see it actually starts kind of dragging what I have. Now, this is super useful because it means that ideally I'd be able to drag what's in here and plop it down somewhere within my flow. Now let's inspect this drag event. It looks like a fairly what we would expect from the drag event. What I'm really looking for though is being able to pass data from here, being able to say when the drag event starts, being able to write data like metadata about the type, And then when it's dropped onto React Flow can read the type that is being dropped and where it's being dropped and essentially create a new node there. So that's the hard part. The hard part isn't being able to drag this. Obviously, we can already do that with that minimal API. The hard part is being able to intercept that from React Flow. So that's what we're going to be working on now. So let's go over to React Flow in our layout. Unfortunately, I was dumb, and when I was setting up this process, I decided to essentially name everything index.tsx inside of its own directory, which I thought, oh, this is going to be great for naming conventions. That way everything's sort of organized and hierarchical in nature, but it's not very nice because now I have like a million index types. So index names, that is. So yeah, that's kind of an unfortunate situation that I decided to get myself into. However, we can take a look at Flow here, and we can notice that the use interface is actually a use context hook, and it's hooking into this context, which is the interface context. Now, interface provides a few different utilities that are very useful so far. So, for example, it provides the 3 controller utility, which allows the 3D preview, which doesn't really exist yet. But it allows the 3D preview to define a reset controls function, which can then be called up here in the toolbar. So if I was in the 3D preview, then I could hit this reset view button and it would reset the view. Now, that is modeled as well through all of these different functions, which allow me to sort of tap into the state of the React Flow. This is highly inspired by Figma, which has a lot of these nice utilities. Obviously, the UI looks a lot like Figma right now, and that's just because I love using Figma as an editor for different things, and so I'm going to be looking into changing up the UI, but for now, that's what it'll look like. Anyway, so I've got this interface context. So one way that I'm thinking is once we dispatch an on-click event in a given or an on-drag event in the node, once this starts, it can tap into the interface context and basically say, hey, I'm selected, I'm currently being dragged, and then the React Flow can subscribe to that, and then when the event is ended, when the React Flow picks up that the node has been dropped, it can read from that selected and add the node that way. So that is one way that I'm thinking, but it is not by any means the way that I would like to do this. What I would like to do is utilize the React sort of default behavior, and not even React, but HTML's default behavior, which would allow me to, when I start this, basically encode information into the event itself. That is my hope, is that I can use these data attributes, data type, node type, data ID schema, etc. And then when inside of the layout, I detect a thing being dropped, it should be able to intercept that. So on drag enter, I think it would be. On drag enter, and I want to do on drag enter capture. Essentially what capturing and bubbling are is it's the propagation of events and how it works. If you do on drag enter, it means anything inside of me, any element inside of this current element, when this event happens, it should also trigger this event. And that can be configured on those sub elements as well. Basically, what that means is that theoretically, when this happens, I should be able to console log out, drag enter, and then E, and I should be able to get some information there. So ideally, when I drag this, I've drag entered now, and we can see that on the left. Now, the thing is, this does give me some information. The target, if I can find it, does have a data set on here. And that means, ideally, that we should be able to inspect the target, and it should give us some sort of information. So let's try to grab that. We want the data set, so let's do log data set, which is e.target.dataset. Oh, it isn't. Current target.dataset, maybe. Okay, let's see if that works. So now I can do that. And dataset is a DOM string map of nothing. So that's super useful. It isn't, because that means that this isn't mapping as I had previously expected it to. How do I handle this? I do wonder. This is one of those bugs that's just kind of annoying. Dataset. Let's see if I can get the dataset that way. See if when I do that, it'll give me the dataset. Okay, so that's nice. It does tell me the dataset here, but for some reason, on the enter event, and the reason why this is happening is because the enter event actually is targeting this element and not the one that is actually being entered. So that isn't particularly helpful. Okay, I need, during drag operations, okay, HTML drag and drop uses the HTML event model and drag events inherited from mouse events. A typical drag operation begins with when a user selects a draggable element, continues when the user drags the element to a droppable element, and then ends when the user releases the dragged element. Interesting. During drag operations, several event types are fired, and some events might fire many times, such as the drag and drag over events. That makes sense. So what I want to know is, we've got drag event. Okay, so that's the drag event. On drag. And then we want on drop. That's what I'm thinking we actually want. On drop. And we want on drop capture, like we had said. Now drop enter. Now let's take a look at how the actual drop event works. The drop event is fired when an element or text selection is dropped on a valid drop target. To ensure that the drop event always fires as expected, you should include a prevent default call in the part of your code which handles the drag over event. Very interesting. And then, in addition to the properties listed above, properties from the parent interface event are available. Okay, so there's a data transfer that seems like it could be potentially fairly useful. Let's try kind of utilizing that. I want to say event.datatransfer.setData. I don't want to test, and then let's just try to grab that event. Now I want the I don't necessarily need the target if this data transfer part works. So let's try to get the data transfer, if it works how I expect it to work. e.datatransfer.getDataTest. Let's see if that works. Theoretically, now if I go over here, it should have automatically reloaded, but if I do that, okay, it doesn't look like it even detected it, and I'm wondering if that's not because I don't have the drop event. Drop. Okay, that didn't work how I had hoped at all. Let's see, a minimal drag and drop example. That would be super useful. So this is draggable, and then this has the class of drop zone. So, okay, so we have the source. This is the draggable. Source add event listener, drag start, dragged equals event.target. Okay, so we're just keeping track of some state here. That doesn't seem super useful because I would like to be able to not keep track of some global intermediate state. But if that's what we have to do, then that's what we'll have to do. Anyway, so target equals target.getElementID, drop target, yeah, on drag over, it'll just kind of prevent the default on drag over. That's interesting. So maybe we need to do that as well. on drag over capture, we want E, and we want to E.prevent default. Wonder if that'll kind of help it out. And then after that, on the drop event, we want to prevent default on that as well. And if E.target.className equals drop zone, then dragged.parentNode.removeChild dragged and event.target.appendChild dragged. Okay, so this is just using dragged to actually remove the other thing, basically from that. So maybe this will work. Aha! We have data transfer. That is beautiful. Maybe. Yeah. Okay, that's pretty neat, because now we can just do node, and then we can just stringify it like .stringify like was being suggested. So let's actually check that out. Console.log node equals E dot, well, equals E dot data transfer dot get data node, and then we want to parse that. JSON.parse. Let's see how that looks. If I do that, it looks like we have the node. That is honestly quite cool. So what that means is that now inside of here, when I get that node, I can, well, I do need to do a couple of other things, but essentially that means that I can what does that mean? It means that I should be able to intercept that node data and have something render on here. The question that I have now, though, is how do I get coordinates in here? I need to know what the coordinates are that I am dropping into. I guess I can just record those coordinates in a piece of state. New chords. Let's just try that. Let's just do a piece of ref, a ref, which will be X and Y. Now, on drag over capture, E.prevent default, and then new chords.current will equal that. That way, console.log new chords. It will prevent re-rendering every time, but it will also allow us to basically go, aha, now, if I do it over here, okay, that's awesome. Now I should be able to make a new handle drop. Let's do add node first. Let's make a new add node function in here. So I'll do node, and then that should be a node. Is that correct that that's a type? Okay, perfect. So const construct ID. That's one thing that we'll need. So we'll need the ID, which will be a string, which will be an ID schema, not actually the ID. So the ID schema will look something like plate carrier.id. Yeah, perfect. So where plate carrier is the type and ID should be replaced with the number of them currently. And I should probably bring that onto a new string. Plate carrier is the type, and ID should be replaced with the number of them currently. So const type is just going to be the first part of it, and then after that, I need that, don't I? The const ID. Okay, cool. So it'll give me a bunch of these. Node state. That's not exactly what I want. I want to go through all the nodes, and I want to see how many of them. Const num of type equals nodes dot filter for every node where n dot ID, 'cause n.type equals type.length, and then I can basically return ID schema replace I'm going to return type and then num of type. So yeah, that should theoretically work. If there are 0, it'll be 0, so there should be 0 indexed. So now when we add a node, we can get const ID equals, well, actually, we should just be able to do set nodes, and then basically like that. So I'm not sure that this is really a necessary function, but we'll keep it. We'll keep it. We can add some sort of stuff in there later. So now we want to do const handle drop, which will basically take that drop event and it will parse the node, handle drop node. So we actually just want the node, which will be type of, what does it look like in here? What do we need? We need the chords, which will be something like x number and then y number. And then we need, after the chords, we'll need the label, which will be a string. We'll need the type, which will be a string. Or we can even just do data, which will be any. And then we're going to add node, which will be, oh, and then we need ID in here. ID schema. So ID will be construct ID from the ID schema. Then we need the type, the position. What is this supposed to look like? So the position is an XY position. Okay, so that should work as expected. What is it? What else does it want? Data is required here, and then data. Now, fix that. Let's see what that looks like when we handle drop node. Chords. We can even just deconstruct new chords.current. What in the world is it doing? I feel like I'm not noticing something here. Okay, let's do that. Chords. Am I like, oh yeah, I'm totally formatting this completely wrong. Node, ID schema, type will be node.type, and the data will be node.data. Perfect. Current data node. Node.label or node.data, or it'll just be an empty thing. We don't need anything fancy. Let's see if this works. It'd be crazy if it did. It does. Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, cool. Very, very cool. So theoretically, okay, so the carrier, that's not implemented yet. I shouldn't have tried to put that in there, but that's pretty neat. It's kind of iffy on in terms of the actual, like, how those coordinates are working, but it's pretty cool that I can drag and drop those. Thank you for tuning in. If you tuned in, I think I'm gonna wrap it up because frankly I'm pretty happy with this, and hopefully you guys got something out of it. If you did, let me know. If you didn't, that's also fine. I'd be interested in hearing feedback, suggestions. If you guys have any, like, hey, you did that in a really stupid way and you should do it better next time, I would love to hear that as well. So let me know, and I hope you guys all have a good day and happy coding.